The burgundy roses lining the pews of St. Augustine's chapel seemed to pulse with my racing heartbeat as I stood there in my grandmother's vintage lace wedding dress, the antique pearls at my throat feeling suddenly too tight. The string quartet's gentle melody faded into an uncomfortable silence as my fiancé, Julian Ashworth, cleared his throat, his perfectly pressed tuxedo somehow making him look more like a stranger than the man I'd fallen in love with 2 years ago. Before we continue, shout out your location in the comments. If this story moved you, hit subscribe. Our community is growing, and tomorrow's story is one you won't want to miss. What happened next would shatter not just my heart, but expose a web of deception so intricate that it would destroy one of Millbrook Heights' most respected families forever. Before we continue, Julian announced, his cultured Boston accent carrying easily through the vaulted ceiling of the historic chapel, there's something that needs to be addressed. I felt the collective intake of breath from our 180 guests. My mother, radiant in her navy mother-of-the-bride dress, leaned forward in the front pew, confusion flickering across her features. My father, distinguished professor emeritus at Millbrook University, adjusted his glasses with the same methodical precision he brought to his archaeological research. Julian reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a thick manila envelope, the kind used for legal documents. My stomach dropped as I recognized the letterhead of Pemberton Cross and Associates, the most prestigious law firm in the city. "Amelia," he said, using my full name instead of the Amy he'd whispered during countless intimate moments, "my family's attorney has prepared some documents that need your signature before we can proceed with the ceremony." The murmur that rippled through the congregation was audible. Wedding guests exchanged glances, phones discreetly emerging from purses and suit pockets, as people sensed they were about to witness something extraordinary. "Documents?" I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. The microphone clipped to Julian's lapel meant every word was being broadcast to the entire chapel. "A prenuptial agreement," Julian's mother Vivian Ashworth announced from her seat in the front row. She stood with the regal bearing that came from 5 generations of old money, her Chanel suit immaculate, her silver hair styled in the same chignon she'd worn to every social event I'd attended with Julian. "Surely you didn't think Julian would marry without protecting the family's interests. The Ashworths have been in Millbrook Heights since 1847. We've learned to be careful about whom we allow into the family's circle." The condescension in her voice was unmistakable. Around me, I could feel the wedding guests, my friends, my colleagues from the museum where I worked as a curator, my family, watching this humiliation unfold in real time. Julian's younger sister, Natasha, seated beside their mother, didn't even try to hide her smirk. She'd never liked me, making snide comments about my quaint middle-class background, my off-the-rack dresses, my parents' modest suburban home. Now she was savoring my public embarrassment. "The document is quite straightforward," Julian continued, producing a gold pen that probably cost more than my monthly salary. "Just sign at the bottom of each page, and we can proceed with the ceremony." Father Morrison, who'd known my family for 20 years, looked deeply uncomfortable behind his ceremonial robes. He'd performed my parents' wedding renewal just 5 years ago, had baptized me as an infant in the same chapel. The disappointment in his eyes was almost as painful as the betrayal I was feeling. "You want me to sign this now?" I asked, gesturing to the assembled guests. "In front of everyone? Without having a lawyer review it?" "There's nothing controversial in the agreement." Julian's father, Theodore Ashworth Sr., spoke from his wheelchair in the front row. The family patriarch had suffered a stroke 2 years ago, but retained his sharp legal mind and sharper tongue. "Standard provisions to protect assets acquired before the marriage. Surely a bright young woman like yourself can understand the necessity." The patronizing tone made my cheeks burn. I'd spent 2 years trying to win this family's acceptance, attending their charity galas, learning their social customs, pretending to enjoy their country club lifestyle. And now, in front of God and everyone who mattered to me, they were making it crystal clear that I was nothing more than a temporary intrusion into their carefully curated world. My best friend Chloe, standing at the altar in her bridesmaid dress, gave me an encouraging nod. She'd never trusted Julian's family, had always said there was something off about how they treated me like a musing novelty rather than their son's serious girlfriend. "Take your time, dear," Vivian said with false sweetness. "Though, of course, the chapel is reserved for other events later today, and our reception guests at the Millbrook Heights Country Club are expecting us." Even now, even in this moment, she was reminding me of my place in their hierarchy. The country club where my parents had never been invited, where I'd always felt like I was wearing a costume instead of my own clothes. I looked down at the prenup again, my eyes focusing on a clause I'd missed before. In the event of infidelity on the part of the bride, all personal property acquired during courtship shall be returned to the Ashworth family. The engagement ring on my finger, the one Julian had claimed belonged to his beloved grandmother, suddenly felt like a shackle. How many other gifts over the past 2 years had been calculated moves to ensure I'd have something to lose if I ever crossed them? But as I stood there in my grandmother's wedding dress, holding the document that would legally formalize my second-class status in the Ashworth family, I realized something that Julian and his family had completely overlooked. They'd made one crucial mistake. They assumed I was the naive museum curator from the wrong side of Millbrook Heights who'd been dazzled by their wealth and status. They assumed I'd sign anything to secure my place in their world. What they didn't know was that for the past 6 months, I'd been conducting the most important research project of my career. And the subject of that research was sitting right here in this chapel, completely unaware that their family's darkest secrets were about to be exposed in the most public way possible. I looked up from the prenup, meeting Julian's expectant gaze with a calm that surprised even me. "You're absolutely right," I said, loud enough for every guest to hear clearly. "There are some things that need to be addressed before the ceremony can continue." I reached into the hidden pocket of my wedding dress, a modification I'd insisted on, claiming I wanted to carry something borrowed from my grandmother. What I withdrew wasn't a handkerchief or a piece of family jewelry. It was a USB drive. Julian's confident smile faltered for just a fraction of a second as I walked toward the altar stand microphone where Father Morrison had set up a small laptop for the ceremony's musical selections. "Since we're sharing legal documents," I announced to the stunned congregation, connecting the drive to the laptop, "I think everyone here deserves to see the complete picture of what they're witnessing today." The silence in the chapel was so complete that I could hear the autumn wind rustling through the maple trees outside. Because this isn't just about a prenup. This is about a family that spent decades lying not just to me, but to everyone in this room. This story took hours to research and craft, so if you're enjoying it, a quick subscribe would truly make our day. Now, let's get back to it. The laptop screen flickered to life, casting a blue glow across the altar as the USB drive loaded its contents. Julian took a half step forward, his face shifting from confusion to concern, as he realized I wasn't bluffing about having my own documents to share. "Amy, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice tight with a control I'd never heard before. "This isn't the time or place for what? For honesty? For transparency? I thought those were family values, Julian." The chapel's projection screen, normally used for displaying hymn lyrics during Sunday services, now showed a series of financial documents, bank statements, property records, and corporate filings that I'd spent months meticulously gathering and organizing. Vivian Ashworth rose from her seat, her composure cracking slightly. "Young lady, I don't know what you think you are accomplishing, but this is hardly appropriate." "Mrs. Ashworth," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the chapel sound system, "I think our guests deserve to understand exactly what kind of family I was about to marry into, especially since you've made such a point of questioning my worthiness." I clicked to the first document, a property deed dated 18 months ago.
The address appears on screen, 1247 Riverside Drive, the modest two-bedroom house that Julian had been living in when we met. Julian told me he was renting this house, I announced to the congregation, said his landlord was flexible about late payments, which explained why he sometimes needed to borrow money from me.
But as it turns out, I continued, clicking to the next document, Julian doesn't rent this house. The Ashworth Family Trust purchased it specifically for him to live in during our courtship. Cash purchase, $340,000. Julian's face had gone pale. Amy, you don't understand the family's financial arrangements. Oh, but I do understand, I replied, advancing to the next screen, because I've spent the last 6 months learning everything I could about the Ashworth family's financial arrangements. It's amazing what you can discover when you know how to research property records, corporate filings, and charitable foundation documents. Theodore Ashworth Sr. wheeled himself forward slightly, his sharp eyes fixed on the laptop screen. Even from his wheelchair, his presence commanded attention. Miss Crawford, whatever you think you've uncovered. Mr. Ashworth, I said, meeting his gaze directly, I've uncovered quite a lot, starting with the fact that your family's total net worth isn't the $15 million you declared on your country club membership application. I clicked to a comprehensive financial summary I'd compiled, color-coded and cross-referenced like the museum exhibition catalogs I created for work. The numbers on screen made several guests gasp audibly. The actual Ashworth family fortune, spread across 17 different corporate entities and 3 offshore trusts, is approximately $847 million. The silence in the chapel was deafening. Even Father Morrison looked stunned by the revelation. $847 million, I repeated, letting the number sink in. That makes the Ashworth family one of the 50 wealthiest families in New England. Yet for 2 years, Julian let me split dinner bills and pay for our weekend getaways. Chloe, still standing at the altar in her bridesmaid's dress, actually laughed, a short, sharp sound that broke the tension momentarily. She had always suspected Julian was hiding something, though even she couldn't have guessed the scale of his deception. But the money isn't even the most interesting part, I continued, clicking to a new section of documents. What's fascinating is how the Ashworth family has been hiding their wealth for decades, and why. The screen now displayed newspaper clippings from the 1980s, carefully preserved digital scans that had taken me weeks to locate in various historical archives. Ashworth Industries, I announced, was one of the largest defense contractors during the Cold War. They made their fortune manufacturing components for weapon systems, including several projects that were later deemed problematic. Julian's sister Natasha had gone completely still, her earlier smirk replaced by obvious panic. She knew what was coming next. The Riverside chemical spill of 1983, I said, clicking to a series of news articles. 17 families displaced, 3 children hospitalized with respiratory problems, groundwater contamination that lasted for years. The headlines filled the screen. Ashworth Industries cited for safety violations, and families seek damages in chemical spill case. The company paid minimal fines and settled out of court for undisclosed amounts. But what's interesting is what happened immediately after the settlement. I advanced to the next document, corporate dissolution papers and asset transfers. Ashworth Industries was quietly disbanded and all assets were transferred to a web of holding companies and family trusts designed to hide the family's wealth from future litigation. They've been living off investment returns for 40 years while maintaining the fiction of being merely well off rather than extraordinarily wealthy. My mother had her hand pressed to her mouth, clearly overwhelmed by the scope of what I was revealing. My father, however, was taking notes in the small notebook he always carried, his historian's instincts kicking in as he documented what he clearly recognized as a significant revelation.
Theodore Ashworth Sr. finally spoke, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to controlling conversations. "Miss Crawford, whatever you think you've uncovered, on your son's character, on the family I was about to marry into, I think they have significant bearing, Mr. Ashworth." I clicked to the next section, recent financial records. Because the Ashworth family hasn't just been hiding their wealth, they've been actively using it to manipulate people, including me. The screen now displayed a series of payments from various Ashworth-controlled accounts. Each transaction was carefully documented with dates, amounts, and recipients. 6 months ago, when Julian told me he was having cash flow problems and needed to borrow $3,000 from me, the Ashworth Family Trust had just received a quarterly dividend payment of $2.3 million from their investment portfolio. I let that sink in before continuing. "But more interesting are these payments," I said, highlighting a series of smaller transactions. Monthly payments to Riverside Property Management, the company that Julian claimed was his landlord. Except Riverside Property Management is owned by Theodore Ashworth Jr., Julian's uncle. Julian was shaking his head, trying to interrupt, but I pressed on. "Julian never had a landlord," I announced. His entire financial persona was carefully crafted theater. The borrowed money, the split bills, the modest lifestyle, it was all designed to make me feel like we were equals while his family evaluated whether I was suitable marriage material. Vivian Ashworth stood up abruptly. "This is ridiculous. Julian's personal finances are hardly personal," I laughed, the sound echoing through the chapel. "Mrs. Ashworth, nothing about Julian's life has been personal, including our relationship." I clicked to the final document in this section, a series of email exchanges that had taken me weeks to piece together from various sources.
"These emails," I said, "are correspondence between Julian and a private investigation firm called Blackstone Security Services. They detail a comprehensive background investigation conducted on me and my family beginning 3 weeks after Julian and I started dating. The emails filled the screen, each one a violation of privacy that made the prenup seem insignificant by comparison. Credit reports, employment history, medical records, social media analysis, interviews with former colleagues and roommates, I listed. The Ashworth family has known more about my personal life than I've shared with my closest friends." Father Morrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. As someone who'd known my family for decades, he was clearly disturbed by the revelation that we'd been investigated without our knowledge. "But the most interesting part," I continued, clicking to a specific email dated just 3 months ago, "is this assessment from the investigation firm's final report." I read directly from the screen. "Subject demonstrates suitable background for discrete integration into client-family social circle. No significant financial assets or family connections that would complicate future separation if necessary. Recommend proceeding with controlled engagement." The chapel fell silent, except for the sound of my mother's quiet gasp. Even the autumn wind outside seemed to have stilled. "Controlled engagement," I repeated. "That's what our relationship has been, Julian. A controlled engagement, designed to keep me just close enough to feel invested, but never close enough to threaten your family's carefully maintained secrets." Julian finally found his voice, though it sounded strange and unfamiliar. "Amy, you're misunderstanding these documents. The investigation was for your protection as much as ours." "My protection?" I turned to face him directly, feeling a clarity I hadn't experienced in months. From what exactly? But I already knew the answer. And more importantly, I knew that what I'd revealed so far was just the beginning. The USB drive contained folders I hadn't even opened yet. Documents that would make Julian's financial deception look like a minor character flaw compared to what his family had really been hiding behind their carefully maintained facade of respectability. I looked out at the assembled guests, friends, family members, colleagues, all of them processing the revelation that the wedding they'd come to celebrate had been built on a foundation of lies and manipulation. "The prenup makes so much more sense now, doesn't it?" I asked,
holding up the document Julian had presented just minutes earlier. It's not about protecting family assets from a gold-digging wife. It's about ensuring that when you eventually discard me, as the investigation firm's report clearly anticipates, I'll have no legal claim to discover the full extent of your family's hidden wealth. I smiled, feeling genuinely happy for the first time in months. But here's what you didn't count on, Julian. You assumed I was just a small-town museum curator who'd be dazzled by your family's sophistication. What you didn't realize is that research is what I do for a living, and I'm very, very good at it. I clicked to a new folder on the USB drive, one labeled Charitable Foundation Records. The screen filled with documents that made the previous financial revelations look straightforward by comparison. The Ashworth Foundation for Community Development, I announced, reading from the tax filings displayed on screen. Established in 1985, shortly after the chemical spill settlements. According to their public records, they've donated over $12 million to various charitable causes over the past 4 decades. Several guests nodded approvingly. The foundation was well known in Millbrook Heights social circles, regularly hosting fundraising galas that Julian had insisted I attend. I'd spent countless evenings watching the Ashworth family accept praise for their philanthropic efforts. But what's interesting, I continued, advancing to the next document, is where those donations actually went. The screen now showed a detailed breakdown of the foundation's expenditures. Instead of the expected list of hospitals, schools, and community organizations, the recipients were a collection of shell companies and consulting firms. Riverside Community Improvement LLC received $2.3 million over 5 years. Millbrook Educational Consulting got $1.8 million. Heritage Property Solutions was paid $950,000. I paused, watching recognition dawn on several faces in the congregation. These aren't charities, I announced. They're all companies owned by various Ashworth family members. The charitable foundation has been nothing more than an elaborate tax avoidance scheme, allowing the family to funnel money between their own businesses while claiming millions in tax deductions. Theodore Ashworth Sr.'s hands gripped his wheelchair armrests tightly. For the first time since I'd known him, the family patriarch looked genuinely shaken. But the foundation served another purpose, I continued, clicking to a series of correspondence files. The emails on screen detailed a systematic approach to purchasing properties throughout Millbrook Heights, always through intermediary companies that obscured the Ashworth family's involvement. When the foundation identified a blighted area in need of community improvement, Ashworth-controlled companies would quietly purchase surrounding properties at below-market prices. Then the foundation would announce a major redevelopment project, driving up property values before the family sold their holdings at massive profits. My father was no longer just taking notes. He was staring at the screen with the expression of someone witnessing a masterclass in academic fraud. As a professor, he understood the implications of using a nonprofit organization for personal enrichment.
The Riverside District redevelopment project from 3 years ago, I said, highlighting specific transactions. The foundation announced a $5 million community center, which generated enormous publicity about revitalizing the neighborhood. Property values increased by 40% within 6 months. I clicked through a series of property transfers, each one precisely timed to maximize the family's profit. But the community center was never built, I revealed. Instead, the foundation quietly withdrew from the project, citing regulatory challenges. Meanwhile, Ashworth-controlled entities had already sold their properties to developers for $12 million more than their initial investment. Chloe shook her head in disgust. She lived in the Riverside District and had been excited about the promised community center, even volunteering for the planning committee that had apparently been meaningless theater. The pattern repeats across 7 different neighborhoods in Millbrook Heights. Announce charitable project, buy properties secretly, generate excitement to drive up values, sell at profit. Abandon the promised improvements. The foundation's tax-exempt status made the entire operation even more lucrative. Julian finally stepped forward, his composure completely gone. Amy, you're mischaracterizing legitimate business practices. Urban development is complex. Is it complex?
I interrupted, clicking to a new document. Or is it fraud? The screen displayed email exchanges between Julian and various city planning officials, correspondence I'd obtained through Strategic Freedom of Information requests during my research. These emails showed Julian coordinating with city planners to ensure that zoning changes aligned perfectly with the foundation's property acquisition timeline, I announced. He used his position at his father's law firm to access confidential development plans months before they became public. The implications hit the room like a physical wave. Several guests who worked in local government looked deeply uncomfortable, clearly recognizing the ethical violations involved in sharing confidential planning information. But the real estate fraud was just one piece of a much larger operation, I said, opening another folder. Let me introduce everyone to the Ashworth family's political influence network. The screen filled with campaign contribution records, carefully cross-referenced with legislative votes and regulatory decisions affecting the family's business interests. Mayor Richardson, who approved every single one of the foundation's redevelopment proposals, I clicked through his campaign finance records, received $47,000 in contributions from companies controlled by the Ashworth Family Trust. I advanced to the next politician's records. City Council member Patricia Wong, who chaired the zoning committee during the Riverside District project, $23,000 in campaign contributions, plus her daughter received a full scholarship to Pemberton Academy, a scholarship funded by the Ashworth Foundation. The Methodist minister, who'd performed several weddings Julian and I had attended together, was shaking his head in obvious dismay. The intersection of charitable fraud and political corruption clearly violated every principle he held dear. State Representative Michael Torres, who sponsored the tax incentive legislation that saved the foundation $340,000 annually, I clicked through his next politician's records. His wife's consulting firm received $85,000 in contracts from Ashworth-controlled businesses. But the next revelation caused audible gasps throughout the chapel. And Judge Catherine Pemberton, who presided over the civil litigation resulting from the original Ashworth Industries chemical spill, I displayed her financial records alongside the family's political contributions. Her husband's law firm received over $200,000 in legal work from the Ashworth family in the 2 years following the settlement. Father Morrison stepped forward, clearly struggling with his role as officiant in what had become a public exposure of decades of corruption. Perhaps we should continue, I said firmly, because Judge Pemberton's connection to the Ashworth family reveals something even more disturbing. I clicked to a new section of documents, ones that had required weeks of careful research to obtain and verify. The families affected by the 1983 chemical spill never received the compensation they were promised. The sealed settlement agreements, which I obtained through sources at the state archives, show that the Ashworth family agreed to establish a medical monitoring fund for affected children. The screen displayed the original settlement terms alongside current financial records. That fund was supposed to provide health care coverage for respiratory problems and other conditions linked to the chemical exposure. It should contain approximately $3.2 million after 40 years of investment growth. I paused, letting the audience absorb the implications of what I was about to reveal. The fund contains $127,000. The rest was quietly transferred to other Ashworth family accounts through a series of administrative fees and management charges that consumed 96% of the money intended for sick children. The silence in the chapel was profound. Even Vivian Ashworth had stopped trying to interrupt, her face pale with what might have been shame or simply fear of what else I might reveal. 3 of those children developed severe asthma that required lifelong treatment. Their families assumed their medical costs were being covered by the settlement fund. Instead, they've been paying out of pocket for decades while the Ashworth family used their money to fund political campaigns and real estate investments. I clicked through medical records and treatment costs, each document a testament to the human cost of the family's financial manipulation. But the medical fund theft was just the beginning, I announced, opening yet another folder. Because the Ashworth family's political network wasn't just about protecting their business interests, it was about covering up ongoing criminal activity. The new documents on screen detailed a series of environmental violations at properties owned by Ashworth-controlled companies, each incident carefully managed to avoid public attention or significant penalties. Between 2018 and 2023, companies linked to the Ashworth family were cited for 17 different environmental violations: illegal dumping, groundwater contamination, air quality violations, improper waste disposal.
I clicked through photographs taken by environmental inspectors, images of contaminated soil and polluted water that painted a disturbing picture of ongoing environmental damage. The total fines assessed for these violations should have been $2.3 million, I announced. The amount actually paid was $89,000. Thanks to legal maneuvering by Theodore Ashworth Sr.'s law firm and favorable rulings from judges who'd received Ashworth family campaign contributions. Julian's uncle, Theodore Jr., stood up from his seat near the back of the chapel, his face red with anger. "This is libel," he shouted. "These are confidential business records obtained illegally." "Actually," I replied calmly, "these are public records, available through Freedom of Information requests, environmental database searches, and legal filings. Everything I'm showing you was obtained through perfectly legal research methods." I smiled at Theodore Jr.'s obvious panic. "The same research methods I use every day in my work as a museum curator, where accuracy and source verification are fundamental requirements." I clicked to the next section of documents, ones that would make the environmental violations seem minor by comparison. But we haven't even discussed the Ashworth family's most recent business venture, I announced, the one that Julian has been personally involved in managing for the past 18 months. The screen filled with incorporation documents for a company called Heritage Restoration Services, established just weeks after Julian and I had started dating seriously. Heritage Restoration Services specializes in, quote, historical preservation consulting, unquote. I read from the company's mission statement. They advise property owners on maintaining the historical integrity of vintage buildings and landmarks. Several guests who worked in Millbrook Heights' tourism industry nodded recognition. The company had been involved in several high-profile preservation projects that had generated positive media attention for the city. But what Heritage Restoration Services actually does, I clicked through internal company documents, is identify historically significant properties owned by elderly or financially struggling families, then systematically pressure those families into selling at below-market prices. The evidence on screen detailed a predatory business model that targeted some of the community's most vulnerable residents. The company would approach elderly homeowners with offers to assess their properties for historical significance. Then they'd produce reports claiming that expensive renovations were required to meet historical preservation standards, renovations that would cost more than the properties were worth. I displayed a series of these fraudulent assessment reports, each one designed to convince homeowners that their family properties had become financial liabilities. Faced with overwhelming renovation costs they couldn't afford, the homeowners would sell to Heritage Restoration Services for a fraction of market value, I continued. The company would then make minimal cosmetic improvements and resell the properties to developers at enormous profits. The scope of the scheme was staggering. Over 18 months, Heritage Restoration Services had acquired 43 properties throughout Millbrook Heights, displacing dozens of longtime residents while generating millions in profits for the Ashworth family. But the most disturbing aspect of Heritage Restoration Services, I clicked to the final section of documents, is how they selected their targets. The screen now displayed detailed demographic analysis and property ownership records, cross-referenced with health records and financial information that should have been confidential. The company didn't randomly approach property owners. They specifically targeted elderly homeowners with medical conditions, recent widows struggling with finances, and families dealing with unemployment or other financial hardships.
I clicked through individual case files, each one documenting the systematic exploitation of vulnerable community members. Julian personally managed 17 of these acquisitions, I announced, highlighting his signature on various legal documents, including the property at 847 Maple Street, which belonged to Mrs. Dorothy Chen, an 83-year-old widow with dementia. The case file on screen detailed how Julian had convinced Mrs. Chen to sell her family home of 50 years for $85,000, claiming it needed $200,000 in historical preservation work. The property had been resold 6 months later for $340,000 after minimal improvements. Mrs. Chen is currently living in a state-funded nursing facility. She lost her home and her life savings to a scheme managed by the man I was about to marry. But Mrs. Chen's case wasn't just another example of the Ashworth family's predatory business practices. It was the reason I'd started investigating them in the first place, and the connection was far more personal than anyone in this chapel could have imagined. 6 months ago, I said, my voice growing quieter but more intense, I received a call from Sunset Manor, the state facility where Mrs. Chen now lives. They were trying to locate family members who might be able to provide information about her medical history. I clicked to a new folder, one I'd labeled simply personal. The documents that appeared on screen were medical records, care facility reports, and social services documentation. Mrs. Chen had been asking for someone named Amy in her more lucid moments. The staff assumed it was a daughter or granddaughter, but when they couldn't locate any family members by that name, they started calling everyone named Amy in her old address book. The chapel fell completely silent as the implications of what I was saying began to register. Mrs. Dorothy Chen is my grandmother, my mother's mother, who raised me every summer when I was a child. The woman who taught me to research family histories and preserve old documents. The woman who instilled in me the importance of truth and justice.
My mother's sob echoed through the chapel as she realized the full scope of what had happened. She'd been wondering why her mother had suddenly agreed to sell the family home after years of refusing all offers, why she'd moved to a state facility instead of the comfortable private care we'd been planning. Julian knew exactly who she was, I said, my voice growing stronger with anger. He'd been to family dinners at that house. He'd sat in her kitchen, eating her cookies, listening to her stories about immigrating to America and building a life in Millbrook Heights. I clicked through photographs from our family gatherings, images that showed Julian laughing with my grandmother, helping her with her garden, pretending to care about her well-being while he was planning to steal her home. When I started getting suspicious about Julian's financial situation, I began investigating all of his business dealings, I explained. That's when I discovered Heritage Restoration Services had targeted my own grandmother. The evidence on screen showed the systematic way Julian had manipulated an elderly woman with early-stage dementia, convincing her that her beloved home was a financial burden that would leave her family with debts after her death. He told her the house needed immediate structural repairs to be safe for habitation, I continued, displaying the fraudulent assessment report Julian had personally prepared. He said the city was considering condemnation proceedings that would leave the property worthless. I clicked through recorded conversations between Julian and my grandmother, audio files I'd obtained from the care facility where she now lived. His voice was calm, professional, reassuring, as he lied to a confused elderly woman about imaginary safety hazards and legal problems. But the most devastating part, I said, my voice breaking slightly, was listening to her apologize to me for losing the family home. She thought she'd failed us by selling it. She died thinking she'd made a terrible mistake that would hurt her family. The past tense hit the congregation like a physical blow. Several people gasped, and I saw Julian's face go completely white. Grandma Dorothy passed away 3 weeks ago, I announced. She died in that state facility, confused and alone, believing she'd disappointed the family she'd worked her entire life to protect. Vivian Ashworth made a choking sound, her hand pressed to her throat. Even she seemed to recognize that targeting a family member crossed a line that made all their other crimes pale in comparison. Julian attended her funeral, I continued, clicking to photographs from the service. He held my hand, comforted me in my grief, and never once mentioned that he was the reason she'd lost her home and died in a state facility instead of surrounded by family. I turned to look directly at Julian, whose face had gone from white to green. Did you enjoy the funeral, Julian? Did you feel any remorse while you were comforting me for a loss you'd directly caused? Julian opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The man who always had a smooth answer for everything was finally speechless. But Grandma Dorothy's death revealed something the Ashworth family hadn't counted on. She'd been documenting everything, I said, turning back to the laptop. The screen filled with handwritten notes in my grandmother's careful script, pages from the journal she'd kept faithfully for 60 years. The entries detailed every interaction with Heritage Restoration Services, every lie Julian had told her, every pressure tactic he'd used. My grandmother might have had early dementia, but she was still sharp enough to know something wasn't right, I explained. She wrote down every conversation, kept copies of every document, took photographs of the supposed structural damage that Julian had claimed made her house inhabitable. I clicked through her documentation, a meticulous record that would make any prosecutor proud. She also wrote about her suspicions, I added, displaying a particularly damning journal entry. Amy's young man seems very interested in our house value, asks many questions about insurance and property taxes. Something feels wrong about this situation. The chapel door opened quietly, and several people in dark suits entered, taking positions near the back of the congregation. Julian's head snapped around, and I saw recognition and fear flicker across his face. Detective Sarah Martinez, Financial Crimes Division, one of the newcomers announced, displaying her badge. We've been monitoring this situation as part of an ongoing investigation into Heritage Restoration Services. Theodore Ashworth Sr.'s wheelchair creaked as he tried to turn around to see the law enforcement officers who'd been quietly documenting everything I'd revealed. Agent Robert Kim, FBI White Collar Crime Unit, another official announced. Mrs. Crawford has been cooperating with our investigation for the past 3 months, providing evidence of securities fraud, wire fraud, and elder abuse involving multiple federal crimes. The congregation erupted in whispers as more federal agents revealed themselves among the wedding guests. The elaborate law enforcement presence made it clear that this wasn't just a family dispute about a prenup. It was the culmination of a major criminal investigation. Miss Crawford, Detective Martinez called from the back of the chapel. Are you ready to present the final evidence package? I nodded, clicking to a folder I'd saved for last. The documents that appeared on screen were arrest warrants, indictments, and seizure orders bearing federal court seals. Julian Ashworth, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, elder abuse, and violations of the RICO Act, Detective Martinez announced as she and 2 other officers moved toward the altar.
Julian finally found his voice. This is insane. You can't arrest someone during their wedding ceremony. I have rights. You have the right to remain silent, Agent Tim interrupted, producing handcuffs, which I'd strongly recommend at this point. But I wasn't finished. As Julian was being read his Miranda rights, I clicked through the remaining documents on my USB drive. The arrests don't end with Julian, I announced to the stunned congregation. The federal investigation has identified 17 co-conspirators in the Ashworth family's criminal enterprise. The screen displayed a comprehensive organizational chart showing the roles played by various family members, associates, and professional collaborators in decades of financial crimes. Vivian Ashworth, you're also under arrest, Detective Martinez announced, approaching the front pew. Charges include tax evasion, fraud, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse. Vivian's composure finally cracked completely. This is impossible. We have lawyers. We have connections. You can't just... Your lawyers have already been notified, Agent Kim replied calmly. Several of them are also being investigated for their roles in facilitating your family's criminal activities. I watched as Theodore Ashworth Sr. was assisted from his wheelchair by federal marshals. Despite his stroke-related disabilities, he was still sharp enough to understand that his family's criminal empire was collapsing around him. The Ashworth Foundation's tax-exempt status has been revoked, I announced, reading from official IRS documentation. All assets are being frozen pending investigation and restitution proceedings. I clicked through seizure orders for the family's various properties, bank accounts, and business entities. Decades of accumulated wealth was being legally confiscated to compensate victims and fund the ongoing investigation. Heritage Restoration Services has been shut down by federal order, I continued. All property transactions conducted by the company are being reviewed for fraud, and affected families will be eligible for full restitution. Natasha Ashworth was crying now, her earlier smugness replaced by the reality that her privileged lifestyle was ending permanently. She was being arrested alongside her parents, charged with money laundering and tax evasion related to her role in managing the family's offshore accounts. But the most important outcome, I said, addressing the remaining wedding guests as the Ashworth family was led away in handcuffs, is that my grandmother's death wasn't in vain. I clicked to the final document on my USB drive, the incorporation papers for the Dorothy Chen Foundation for Elder Protection, established with the initial settlement funds that would come from the Ashworth family's seized assets. The foundation will provide legal advocacy, financial counseling, and protection services for elderly residents throughout Millbrook Heights. It will ensure that no other family suffers what mine has endured. As the last of the conspirators were escorted from the chapel, I looked out at the remaining guests, my real friends and family, the people who'd supported me through the grief of losing my grandmother and the shock of discovering my fiancé's true nature. Thank you all for being here today, I said, my voice steady despite the emotional weight of everything that had just transpired. My father stood up, his face showing a complex mixture of pride and sorrow. Amy, your grandmother would be incredibly proud of what you've accomplished today. My mother nodded through her tears. She always said the truth would come to light eventually. I just wish she could have seen this. Father Morrison approached the altar, clearly struggling how to conclude what had become the most unusual ceremony of his career. Perhaps we should offer a prayer for justice, for healing, and for the protection of the vulnerable in our community. As the congregation bowed their heads, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced since my grandmother's death. The prenup that had seemed like such a humiliation just an hour ago now seemed like divine intervention, the final catalyst that had allowed me to expose decades of criminal activity and protect countless future victims. But even as the investigation concluded and justice was being served, I knew that the most important part of this story was just beginning. The work of rebuilding trust, supporting victims, and ensuring that something like this could never happen again in Millbrook Heights. 6 months after what the Millbrook Heights Gazette dubbed the wedding that never was, I stood in the beautifully restored main hall of 847 Maple Street, my grandmother's house, which had been returned to our family as part of the federal restitution settlement. The morning sunlight streamed through the original stained glass windows that Grandma Dorothy had lovingly maintained for 50 years, casting colorful patterns across the hardwood floors Julian claimed were structurally unsound. The house never needed the extensive repairs Heritage Restoration Services had claimed. A legitimate inspection revealed that the property was in remarkable condition for its age, requiring only minor maintenance that my family could easily afford. The dangerous structural damage Julian had used to terrify my grandmother existed only in falsified reports designed to pressure her into selling. The final restitution payment came through yesterday, Detective Martinez informed me as we reviewed the case files in what had once been Grandma Dorothy's sewing room. The Ashworth family seized assets have now compensated all 47 families affected by Heritage Restoration Services. I nodded, still processing the magnitude of what the investigation had ultimately uncovered. The federal task force had traced the Ashworth family's criminal activities back 38 years, identifying over 200 victims of various fraud schemes, environmental crimes, and political corruption cases.
Julian's sentencing is scheduled for next month, Detective Martinez continued. The prosecution is recommending 12 years in federal prison, given his cooperation in identifying other co-conspirators. The cooperation had been Julian's attempt to reduce his sentence, but it had also revealed connections to criminal networks spanning 5 states. His testimony had led to the arrest of corrupt officials, predatory contractors, and fraudulent charitable organizations throughout New England. And Mrs. Chen's case specifically?
I asked, though I knew the answer would bring mixed emotions. Julian pleaded guilty to elder abuse, conspiracy to commit fraud, and wire fraud in connection with your grandmother's case. He'll serve additional time specifically for targeting a vulnerable elderly person. The judge was particularly harsh about the personal betrayal aspect of the crime. I walked to the window where my grandmother used to sit every morning, watching the neighborhood wake up while she planned her day. The view hadn't changed. The same maple trees, the same walkways, the same sense of community that Julian had tried to destroy through his systematic targeting of longtime residents. The Dorothy Chen Foundation has approved funding for 6 new cases this month. Elderly residents who were approached by other predatory companies are getting free legal representation and property assessments. The foundation had grown beyond what I'd initially envisioned. The restitution funds from the Ashworth family's seized assets, combined with donations from community members who'd been outraged by the crimes, had created a substantial endowment dedicated to protecting vulnerable residents. We've also established partnerships with the State Attorney General's office, I continued. Any company that approaches elderly homeowners with unsolicited historical preservation or safety assessment offers gets investigated immediately. Detective Martinez smiled, the first genuinely happy expression I'd seen from her during our months of working together. Your grandmother would be proud of how you've channeled your anger into something constructive. The anger had been overwhelming at first. The rage of discovering that someone I'd trusted had deliberately targeted my family, had manipulated a confused elderly woman, had caused my grandmother to die thinking she'd failed us. It had threatened to consume me entirely. But working with the other victims showed me that revenge, while satisfying in the moment, couldn't undo the harm that had been done. Only systematic change could prevent other families from experiencing what mine had endured. The university has offered me a position heading their new Center for Community Protection Research. It's a joint program between the History Department and the law school, focused on identifying and preventing financial crimes targeting vulnerable populations. The position would allow me to use my research skills on a larger scale, training graduate students to recognize patterns of predatory behavior and developing early warning systems for communities across the region. "Will you take it?" she asked. I looked around the room where my grandmother used to sit every morning, watching the neighborhood wake up while she planned her day. The view hadn't changed. The same maple trees, the same walkways, the same sense of community that Julian had tried to destroy through his systematic targeting of longtime residents. The Dorothy Chen Foundation has approved funding for 6 new cases this month. Elderly residents who were approached by other predatory companies are getting free legal representation and property assessments. The foundation had grown beyond what I'd initially envisioned. The restitution funds from the Ashworth family's seized assets, combined with donations from community members who'd been outraged by the crimes, had created a substantial endowment dedicated to protecting vulnerable residents. We've also established partnerships with the State Attorney General's office. Any company that approaches elderly homeowners with unsolicited historical preservation or safety assessment offers gets investigated immediately. Detective Martinez smiled, the first genuinely happy expression I'd seen from her during our months of working together. Your grandmother would be proud of how you've channeled your anger into something constructive. The anger had been overwhelming at first. The rage of discovering that someone I'd trusted had deliberately targeted my family, had manipulated a confused elderly woman, had caused my grandmother to die thinking she'd failed us. It had threatened to consume me entirely. But working with the other victims showed me that revenge, while satisfying in the moment, couldn't undo the harm that had been done. Only systematic change could prevent other families from experiencing what mine had endured. The university has offered me a position heading their new Center for Community Protection Research. It's a joint program between the History Department and the law school, focused on identifying and preventing financial crimes targeting vulnerable populations. The position would allow me to use my research skills on a larger scale, training graduate students to recognize patterns of predatory behavior
and developing early warning systems for communities across the region. "Will you take it?" she asked. I looked around the room where my grandmother used to sit every morning, watching the neighborhood wake up while she planned her day. The view hadn't changed. The same maple trees, the same walkways, the same sense of community that Julian had tried to destroy through his systematic targeting of longtime residents. The Dorothy Chen Foundation has approved funding for 6 new cases this month. Elderly residents who were approached by other predatory companies are getting free legal representation and property assessments. The foundation had grown beyond what I'd initially envisioned. The restitution funds from the Ashworth family's seized assets, combined with donations from community members who'd been outraged by the crimes, had created a substantial endowment dedicated to protecting vulnerable residents. We've also established partnerships with the State Attorney General's office. Any company that approaches elderly homeowners with unsolicited historical preservation or safety assessment offers gets investigated immediately. Detective Martinez smiled. She needed no further explanation to understand the broader implications of these changes. "Your testimony during the legislative hearings was particularly effective. The committee chair said your personal story made the abstract legal issues real for the legislators. Testifying had been difficult, requiring me to relive the discovery of Julian's betrayal and my grandmother's victimization in front of cameras and reporters. But seeing the legislation pass unanimously had made the discomfort worthwhile."
The ripple effects have spread beyond Millbrook Heights, I told her, clicking through news articles from other states. Connecticut passed similar legislation last month. Massachusetts is considering a comprehensive elder protection bill. Vermont is establishing a task force to investigate historical preservation fraud. The Ashworth family's crimes had exposed vulnerabilities in systems designed to protect vulnerable populations, but the response had been swift and comprehensive. Federal agencies, state governments, and local communities had all implemented new safeguards based on lessons learned from the investigation. Speaking of ripple effects, Detective Martinez said, "Have you seen the news about Theodore Ashworth Sr.?" I hadn't, and her expression suggested the update wouldn't be pleasant. "He died in federal custody 2 weeks ago," she informed me. "Heart attack while awaiting sentencing." He was facing 23 years in prison for his role in organizing the family's criminal enterprise. The news should have brought some satisfaction, but instead, I felt only a hollow sense that justice remained incomplete. Theodore Sr. would never serve his sentence, never face the full consequences of decades of criminal activity, never directly apologize to the families he'd harmed. Vivian and Julian are both cooperating fully now, Detective Martinez continued. Vivian's testimony led to the arrest of 6 more co-conspirators, including 2 judges and a state legislator. She'll likely serve 8 to 10 years instead of the life sentence she was originally facing. The cooperation was strategic rather than remorseful, an attempt to minimize prison time rather than genuine accountability, but the information provided had been invaluable in exposing the full scope of corruption that had enabled the family's crimes for decades. "And Julian?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Still maintaining that he was just following family orders, that he didn't understand the full implications of what he was doing, Detective Martinez replied. The prosecution isn't buying it, given his law degree and direct involvement in targeting specific victims. I walked back to the window where my grandmother used to sit, imagining her watching Julian approach the house with his fraudulent assessment reports and manipulative reassurances. She'd been suspicious from the beginning, but her growing confusion had made her vulnerable to his systematic deception. I received a letter from him last month, through his attorney. He wanted to apologize, to explain his side of what happened. Detective Martinez raised an eyebrow. "Did you read it?" I returned it unopened. There's nothing he could say that would change what he did to my grandmother or to the other families he targeted. Some of the other victims had read similar letters from various Ashworth family members, hoping for genuine remorse or meaningful explanations. Most had been disappointed by self-serving justifications and attempts to minimize responsibility rather than authentic accountability.
The Foundation's newsletter goes out next week, I told Detective Martinez, changing the subject to more positive developments. We're featuring the story of the Martinez family, who used their restitution money to start a small business helping other immigrant families navigate property ownership and legal protections. The newsletter had become an important communication tool, sharing success stories, providing updates on ongoing legal proceedings, and offering practical advice for avoiding similar scams. The circulation had grown to include subscribers throughout New England who'd heard about the Foundation through media coverage. Mrs. Chen's house will remain in the Foundation's ownership indefinitely, I explained as we concluded our meeting. We're converting the upper floor into office space for the Community Protection Research Center while maintaining the main floor as a meeting space for victim support groups and community education programs. It was the perfect tribute to my grandmother's memory, using her beloved home as a center for protecting other vulnerable families, continuing her legacy of caring for her community long after her death. As Detective Martinez gathered her files and prepared to leave, I remained at the window where my grandmother had spent so many mornings. The neighborhood looked peaceful in the afternoon sunlight, but I now knew how much work it took to maintain that peace, to protect the vulnerable from those who would exploit their trust. "One more thing," Detective Martinez said, pausing at the door. "The FBI's Financial Crimes Division wants to offer you a consulting position, analyzing historical patterns in fraud cases, developing prevention strategies for vulnerable populations. Interested?" I smiled, thinking about how my grandmother had always encouraged me to use my talents to help others, to make sure the truth came to light when powerful people tried to hide their crimes. "Send me the details," I replied. I think Grandma Dorothy would approve. That evening, as I locked up the house and headed to my car, I noticed fresh flowers on the small memorial garden we'd planted in the front yard. Community members often stopped by to leave tributes to my grandmother, whose story had become a symbol of resilience and the importance of protecting the vulnerable. The prenup that had seemed like such a devastating humiliation 6 months ago now felt like providence, the catalyst that had exposed decades of criminal activity and created systematic protections for countless other families. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives become the foundation for the most meaningful work we'll ever do. My grandmother's death had been a tragedy that could never be undone, but her legacy, the protection of other vulnerable community members, the exposure of systematic corruption, and the creation of lasting change would continue long after the criminals who targeted her were forgotten in their prison cells. Justice, I'd learned, wasn't just about punishment. It was about ensuring that the truth came to light, that victims were heard and compensated, and that systematic changes prevented similar crimes from happening again. And sometimes it started with having the courage to speak the truth when everyone expected you to stay silent. Got 2 more amazing stories lined up for you. If you dug this one, you're gonna love what's next. Go ahead and click.